Good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Levinson. On behalf of the Senior Center here at Central, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. Today, we are honored to have a media legend, an icon, and I'm referring to Susan Zirinsky, who is the first woman to become president of CBS News. She is currently the president of See It Now Studios, which in the best traditions of Edward R. Murrow and CBS produces brilliant documentaries. And I can tell you that when you've seen one, you'll never forget it. I'll be introducing her in just a few minutes, but there's several points I want to touch on briefly. First, a quick reminder that 1 week from today, on Friday, December 8th, we'll be presenting a special program on the history and culture of Argentina, where they've just had a critical election. Then on December 20th, we will be going back in time to the year 1660 and the Great Fire of London. London had no fire brigade in 1660, and in no time at all, the Protestants were blaming the Catholics. The Catholics were blaming the Protestants. We'll tell you what really happened and why it still matters. Now, a quick reminder that you can shoot a question to Susan Zirinsky at any point during the program this morning. Just go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That's where you'd go to type a question for her. She's happy to respond to any and all questions and will at the end of her presentation this morning. Now, here are some things you should know about our guest. She is universally referred to as Z by the people at CBS and Paramount Plus. She has won every major award that a broadcast journalist can win. And while anyone can produce a program from the safety of a modern studio with all the great equipment that they have, including teleprompters, it's a completely different kettle of fish when there's a breaking news event that can't be predicted or scripted or controlled occurs. And that's why I wanted to remind you that Susan Zirinsky was on the ground in Iraq during Desert Storm. She was in China when the events at Tiananmen Square unfolded. She was directing the CBS coverage of the royal wedding in 2018, just as she'd been a key figure when CBS covered the 1992 Winter Olympics in Albertville, France. And I want to say something now about beloved public personalities, because when Walter Cronkite, Ted Kennedy, Mary Tyler Moore, Nelson Mandela, and others died, it was Susan Zirinsky who produced or executive produced the news specials about their lives that reminded all of us why they mattered so much. So it's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Susan.
Thank you very, very much. I think I'd like you to negotiate my next contract because you definitely have the strong points pointed out. I want to start in the present, and then I'll kind of go backwards and say, how the hell did we get here? How did I get here? Currently, as Dick said, I am the president of CBS News Studios, which is called See It Now, which is actually an Edward R. Murrow title, which he actually used for very special programming at CBS. And the story went that when William Paley knew that Edward R. Murrow was coming over to give him a pitch about a See It Now, Paley was known to have remarked, "I think I'm going to vomit," because it was usually some subject that was going to be very controversial, and Paley would never turn down Edward R. Murrow. The See It Now Studios grew out of a concept that as Viacom joined with CBS, and then we all came under the umbrella of Paramount, it was very important to the new CEO, the head of CBS, George Cheeks, that we kind of represent in this world where journalism is going and kind of a bridge to the future, which I was extremely excited about, especially at my age, where most of my friends are retiring, not me. So See It Now has a mandate of producing for the network. We have 23 episodes of something called FBI True on now. We are doing a program called Becoming CIA for the summer for the network. On Paramount Plus, in 2023, we will have produced 53 hours of programming. And this covers a wide variety of programs. Yes, we lean into crime. I did 48 Hours, a law and justice show for 20 years. So that tells you I see dead bodies. And crime is a very large component of a lot of the successful streamers today. We try to look for very layered stories. We at 48 Hours want to bring justice where it has not occurred. At 48, we got people out of prison. We got compensation for people. So we do lean into crime that has value. We take a look at historical documentaries like January 6th, and we did it on the first anniversary, and Mandy Patinkin narrated the show for us for this. It's 6 hours. And then we went back and looked at how did we get here? How did the dissatisfaction among the country grow? And it was very well received and very exciting. We did everything from the Ghislaine Maxwell story and the incredible story of wealth and power and perpetrating incredibly horrible sexual acts when you're at that level, to 20th anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Watergate, to we worked on the Sean Penn documentary on the Ukraine. So it is a mix of content that is historic, it is iconic, and in terms of what are people talking about, but mostly we want to follow the Murrow order of impact and real difference. We also, aside from producing for CBS Network and Paramount Plus, we produce for the Smithsonian. We produce for Black Entertainment Television, BET. We produce outside, like A Gun for Hire. We did an amazing documentary that had nothing to do with CBS for Garth Brooks. That was actually really cool. And we sell outside to outside cable companies, although I'm winding away from that because they're not paying us enough money, and it's a challenge. So the See It Now Studios, to me, was the bridge of traditional journalism into taking that into the modern place where people are watching. Advertising dollars are precipitously falling. So you have to kind of join the party and figure out, okay, where are the viewers? Where can we go to that they will migrate to? It's very difficult in this day and time. We are at an inflection point globally, as well as in this industry, of how do you stand out? How do you attract viewers? A lot of that is in the social media today, but the reality is breaking through the cacophony of voices is probably the biggest challenge. And you have to offer people something that has value, something that is well told, something that it doesn't have to be always well shot, because people accept very, very raw and dirty kind of video, but it has to be something that is memorable. So that is what we are into producing right now. Very small unit, but we work with production companies all over the world, London and France and Moscow. So we do different things with different people. We co-produce, meaning that we join forces. So I feel that See It Now Studios is an extremely relevant, successful in terms of the content and the nature of the content. I was very happy to get to work on Sean Penn's documentary on the Ukraine. So I think I am a grateful person. I am a grateful person that I was given this opportunity to invent something new, and I'm grateful for the road traveled thus far. I'm going to now start at the beginning because I've given you the here and now. I really began, actually, I was hired 2 weeks after the Watergate break-in. And Dan Rather used to say, I was delivered directly from the maternity ward in a CBS shipping bag to the Washington Bureau. In the early days, there were not a lot of women working, but I never thought about that. It was just the opportunity of a lifetime to be working in a bureau that hailed names like, you may or may not know, George Herman, Marvin and Bernie Kalb, Roger Mudd, Dan Rather, Dan Shore. And I was a kid. I mean, I was in my second year of college. So it was an awakening because I had wanted to be a Hollywood film director. But when I saw what was happening in the Washington Bureau, I thought, this is so important. Yet they're telling stories from a visual standpoint. This is combining everything that I think I want to do. And I remember calling my father and saying, I know what I want to do. I want to be in broadcast journalism. It encompasses everything that's important to me. And I think this is the route to go. And so he said, go with God. And that was the early days. I will tell you that certain events had impact on me. I know Dick mentioned I was literally on the Washington desk answering phones on the weekends. That was my first real job, a desk assistant, and working with the weekend news at that point. So the man that was running the assignment desk, named Sid Fetters, had gone up the street to get dinner. And this was pre-cell phone. And all of a sudden, we were using, there's no computers, there's no cell phones. The wire machines were in these boxes that you'd have to lift them up. You would take the wire, you'd scroll it, you'd read it. Well, on this night, on Saturday night, about 8 o'clock, all of a sudden, all the bells were going off. Like, it was insane. And I walk up to the wire machine, I lift the box, and it is the Saturday Night Massacre. President Nixon fired the Attorney General, and a litany of departures that was, oh my God, like, what do I do now? Within moments, the phone rang, and it was the boss of CBS Washington, who I had never met. And he said, who the hell is this? So I said, I'm the desk assistant. Who may I ask I'm talking to? And he goes, Abba Eban. Now, I knew that the Egyptian foreign minister wasn't calling the news desk, so I assumed it was the bureau chief, Richard Small, Mr. Small. So it was moments before the desk editor came back, and it was hell. I sent a courier to the airport to pick up Dan Rather, and we were on the air for most of the night, and it was, let's just say, it was the best seduction of all times. Much better than eHarmony, JDate, any dating service. I was in love. And I considered the former desire of being a Hollywood director, this is much better. This is much more important. And so that's really how I got my start. It wasn't until, and I had all these small jobs while I was finishing college, but when Watergate was progressing and it really had a dramatic impact on the country, what I saw was that the women in the newsroom didn't feel as important. I was ignoring it, but it came full front and center to me when Lesley Stahl, whose face is probably being cut into the statues on the faces of the historic monuments. Lesley was a young reporter, and she was getting everything, every piece of information during Watergate, and she was always asked to hand it off to one of the other correspondents, men. But one day I got an envelope from the White House, and I really then understood what the score was, and it was to Lesley. So I was going to put it on her desk. And the front row was all the superstars in the world of journalism. And I'm going back and back to the third row. And there in the back row was a tiny desk. It was like a secretarial desk, and it was Leslie's desk. And I put the envelope on there and I thought, okay, I get it now. So, it was a long road, but one of great respect. And Leslie Stahl, I will say out loud, is 80, and she is traveling all over the world. Her duration as a White House correspondent and 60 Minutes is a remarkable career. She stands up to people and speaks truth to power. And Leslie taught me an invaluable lesson. No is the beginning of any conversation. So it's, I feel blessed in having worked with Leslie and Bill Plant and Ed Bradley and Bob Schieffer. And the one thing I did notice that kind of gave me inspiration was that all of these top people had one shared quality: a curiosity, a desperate need to unravel the truth. Our jobs are less, this is heresy today, they're less to express our opinions than they are to take the sides of everybody in some discussion, present it, and let the audience decide. I would say that's not the case now. Right now in journalism, points of view become the kind of most important part of how people are presenting. We at CBS, and I think for the most part, the other networks as well, we feel the neutral zone is the place to be. It doesn't mean you can't report unbelievable transgressions. We have to hold people accountable, but we have to allow the viewer, the reader, to form their own opinions. I think that, from every job I had, seriously, I have taken great value from people that I worked with. And I'll tell the story in a little bit. I mean, even the guy that fired me at CBS, I got a lot out of him as well. In my career, coming out of the weekend news job, I was the evening news production secretary, and I was finishing college. But this was as Nixon was being pushed out of office, and it was history. I was participating in history. I did share my, I did have a fair amount of what we called stakeouts, where you'd go with a crew to a high-level White House person's home in the morning to get a comment of something that developed overnight. And I remember from John Dean and Dwight Chapin, high-level people in the Nixon White House, I would lift their mail slot and I would lean in and I'd say, "Mr. Dean, Susan Zirinsky from CBS, would you be willing to answer some questions?" And I would always hear back, "No." And then the mail slot would close in my face, but I tried. So I was the evening news production secretary, and then I moved into what was probably one of the most amazing jobs, even to this day, was the Washington Bureau researcher. Everybody needed you. There was no computers. You had to know who to call at deadline to get information, correct information, so that Walter, so that Roger Mudd running through the newsroom, going to do his live on-camera close of the evening news, that you were able to supply him with the necessary information. I am grateful. The researcher's job was remarkable. You worked for every show. It was Washington there when Nixon resigned. So it really was a learning experience of the impact and the historic, but the impact of journalism. And God knows we've suffered our bruising over the years, but democracy cannot exist without a free press. They cannot exist without a free press. And Bob Schieffer always talks about that. And I dare say that it is one of the most important aspects of journalism, of what our roles are. And it doesn't change. The technology changes, the way we get to people changes, but the core value of what we represent doesn't change. And I think the challenge that we face now with diminished advertising and just the squeezing of money supply is painful. You know, there was a day where we had bureaus in London, in Bonn, in Moscow, in Tel Aviv, a small office in Jerusalem, in Rome, in Joburg, and right now, and in both in Tokyo and Beijing. Right now, we are really, did I say Moscow? Definitely Moscow. I spent a lot of time there. Right now, we are really basically based in London. We may have pickup people in Bonn, pickup people in Moscow. We are covered in Asia, and we are covered in Rome. But it's a different ball game. But what hasn't changed at all is the mission statement and the moral complexity that we face while trying to cover cataclysmic stories as the funding is decreased. And I think that is what one of the challenges is today. Plus, as I said before, breaking through this cacophony of information coming at you. You know, as I progressed through the ranks and became a producer in the mornings and morning show, and then an evening news producer, I got to really explore the world. And by that, I mean, I became the White House producer, and there were several, but I ended up being the key White House producer. And it was a very daunting job because you were being manipulated. And I don't care what administration it was, you were manipulated, whether it was a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. But I must admit that in covering Jimmy Carter in Plains, Georgia, it was quite an experience, and I was taken back, you know, to some of it in watching Rosalynn Carter's funeral. And one of my first trips into Plains, Georgia, was with Jimmy Carter around Christmas time, and the press was staying in a town called Americus, Georgia. So we're driving a day ahead into the town. Our offices, both CBS, NBC, and ABC, were double wide trailers underneath a water tower in Central Plains. And I remember arriving on the highway, and my cameraman on a walkie-talkie said, "Wow, you must have a lot of friends here." I had no idea what he was talking about. I had been to Plains before, but we got out, and there on the highway was a marquee that said, "Welcome, Susan Zirinsky, White House producer, CBS News." And I'm like, what is that? And I walked into the motel that all the press corps stayed at, and I went to the manager, a man whose name I still remember, Jimmy Murray, and I said, "I'm honored, but why the sign welcoming me?" And in his southern drawl said, "Well, you're the first Jew we've ever had here for Christmas, so we wanted you to feel welcome." So after the shock and taking pictures by my marquee, it was, let's just say these are the memories that you have of some very poignant moments in your life. One of the things about covering Jimmy Carter, and I remember this story, both of the fact that my husband and I both ran in the race in the Camp David Mountains, and I was there when Jimmy Carter collapsed. And it was my first time on network television because I was describing it, but there are these moments. And I think perhaps the most memorable moment came after he lost the election. By that point, the networks weren't staking him out. By that, I mean, there would be a crew with the White House press office that would be the official pool that would travel with him. I was staking him out unilaterally with my camera crew, and the correspondent I'm not going to make the correspondent get up at 5 a.m. And it happened to be a weekend where we had no news shows, so there wasn't really a need. Jimmy Carter takes off with the Secret Service, the guy with the briefcase and the the handcuffs to the nuclear code. And so we're driving and we turn down this dirt road and the president gets out and he's walking and I'm the only member of the press corps, Secret Service, guy with nuclear codes. And Carter turns around and he sees me and he kind of motions me to come forward. And I kind of look behind to think, is he talking to me? I'm the White House producer, but he was. And I walked up and I said, Mr. President, where are we? And he said, we are back in right behind our houses where Rosalind's family burial ground is. And so I could tell there was this, he was quite emotional. And he says, I come back here to think. He had lost the election. It was 2 weeks before the inauguration. And I said, what did you think? What are you thinking about? And he said, my failure to bring the hostages home from Iran. And it was the most incredible 20-minute conversation about how he felt powerless. And there was an attempt, if people remember, to get the hostages out, which was an unbelievable disaster with American soldiers who died. But to have the privilege of being with a president who was unraveling his feelings about failure was pretty extraordinary. So I was in Washington for many years, covering the White House. I covered politics. I also, because I did a lot of logistics in the White House, I was actually sent to various war zones to set up the operation. And that was a very challenging thing. However, I will admit that covering wars as a woman, there weren't very many, was unbelievable for me. I wanted to go to every war in every dangerous location known to man. And I felt that the events were cataclysmic wherever I went. The events would have impact on the world in a global sense. I remember when the United States was trying to get Noriega and he was in Panama. And so I went in to run the operation and we were pinned down. There was a whole bunch of press actually going into Panama and we were on a school bus that was transporting us to a military base. And, you know, there we were pinned down for hours, like we're just journalists on a school bus and they're shooting at us. And it was pretty insane. So those are experiences that, you know, you could be a nervous person, you could be an anxious person, but somehow in those really life-threatening situations, I felt more alive and more responsible and more, my job was important to bring the story into American homes and studios, American homes. And so people really understood what was going on. And because this is pre-cacophony, pre-CNN, we had this responsibility to share what was going on. I won't go through every experience, but I'll hit a couple of them. You know, we went to Moscow to do a documentary on the changing face of Russia. And my job for this documentary, Diane Sawyer was still at CBS, was to get Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, the head of the Moscow party, to do an interview. And because that was going to be the backbone. And I spent about 2 hours inside the Kremlin, this amazing office. I had a translator, he had a translator, and I wasn't getting very far. But this was the critical interview for this documentary called 7 Days in May. So lo and behold, I after about an hour and a half, I remembered Yeltsin had an eye for women. Now, I probably couldn't give this speech in a larger audience, but I went back into my backpack and I pulled out an 8x10 glossy of Diane Sawyer and I walked up to his desk and I slammed the picture on the desk and I said, this is who will do the interview. Translation. And the guy, Yeltsin's face flushed and he goes, Конечно, да. And he put his thumb up, interview arranged. So I don't know why I didn't think of that 2 hours before, but you have to be fast on your feet and totally amenable to not compromise, but use the tools of the trade. I wouldn't say anything bad happened, but we did have an extraordinary, extraordinary interview. I think one of the most, I guess this maybe the most frightening situation was in the Gulf War. And we were, it was a mess. But this is, endless stories here, but Dan Rather was there. We had started in New York. We moved into Dhahran, and we were literally the first network to enter Kuwait. And it was an extraordinary experience. You felt that you were bringing the war into American homes, and American soldiers were there. So all in all, you feel the impact of these dynamic stories. And you can ask questions afterwards, but I felt like I had the opportunity to work with the best of the best. I used to joke with Dan Rather that, because he was always accused of having weird parts of his personality, that if you got 25 miles outside of New York airspace, he was a different guy. And I did a lot of war coverage with him, and I have the utmost respect for him. Yes, there were incidents and trouble, and those usually came into play when he trusted those who he had worked with for so many years. He trusted them with too much responsibility, and he absolutely positively, sorry about the dog, he absolutely positively cared more about the story than anything else. There's a documentary out now on Dan Rather, and it's pretty spectacular. Dan came into China to cover the first Russian visit of a leader in 30 years, Gorbachev. But what it turned out to was a mass, absolute chaotic revolution that no one had anticipated. No one. And Dan was spectacular. The Chinese were going crazy because they had issued all of these visas to come in to cover the Gorbachev. And what was happening? It was a student revolution. Dan was amazing. And, listen, at some point, our satellites were shut down. We were taking tape to airports, giving people $100 bills to carry our tape into Tokyo and Hong Kong. And it was a moment. That probably was the moment where I decided, knowing about the Chinese babies that were being abandoned, that I would, at some point in my life, my husband and I would adopt a Chinese child. But in Tiananmen, what ended up happening was obviously the attack on Tiananmen Square. Dan had left to go back to New York because there was no way to really broadcast out of there. We were in a mode of, we would shoot in the morning, we would shoot in the evening, we would take tapes to the airport, we would give anybody who would carry our videos $100 bills to take it to Tokyo and Hong Kong, where we had editing set up. But at some point, there was the Chinese denied that anybody was killed. We saw people killed. Our correspondent was taken hostage. But it was a series of unbelievable events. And at one point, and this is where I made a decision of being a journalist and being a human being. There was one point that a professor from USC called and said, "Can I come see you with a very important person?" That person was a man named Feng Lizhi. He was a dissident. He was really brilliant. And he came into where we were staying, which had loads of Chinese secret police. And Professor Perry Link was trying to get him asylum in the American embassy. And I got a call from Leslie Stahl, who was at the White House, who said, "We hear Feng Lizhi has been arrested by the Chinese." And I didn't quite know what to say. I said, I'll call you back in 10 minutes. Called her back and I said, Feng Lizhe has not been arrested. I didn't say the rest of the sentence, which is, he's sitting in my room in the hotel right now while we figure out what to do. So it ended up that we hid Feng Lizhe for days. And the Chinese police were coming and circling the hotel. He was not recognized when he came in. And we hid him for about 5 to 7 days. I did not tell anybody in New York, but I felt that this man would be killed if indeed the Chinese got him. I called a CIA person who I knew at the embassy, and I, in code, was saying, I have a very important package that we'd like to give to the embassy. And he finally said, cut the crap, tell me what it is. And I said the words Feng Lizhe, and he hung up. He said, I'll call you back. He called me back on a secure phone, and he said the words, we will take delivery of the package at the Southwest Gate in 1 hour. And after having Feng Lizhe for close to a week, we secreted him out. I got somebody who was working for us, but not CBS, to drive Feng Lizhe to the American embassy, where he would remain for 2 years while the United States and China worked out an asylum agreement. Do I regret that decision? Not at all. But I did call Leslie Stahl and I said, check your sources. We've been told the American embassy has taken Feng Lizhe in to protect him, to try to get him asylum. You know what? I don't regret that at all, ever. You know, you have to make some decisions that may be journalistically questionable, but I never, ever, ever looked back on that. You know, having gotten to go to Panama, to Central America, to the Gulf War, I will admit one thing about the White House coverage. Even though I really like fried chicken and Plains, Georgia, Santa Barbara with Ronald Reagan was a lot better off than Plains, Georgia was. Politics aside, it was just a very pleasant place to spend 8 years coming in and out of. You know, as we progressed and the industry changed so dramatically with CNN and CBS, and Dan and I were in Russia once, and we were literally, it was a change of kind of face. CNN had a big platform in Red Square. We were operating outside the back of a panel truck, and we were taking a manhole cover and plugging in, and that's how our signal was going to New York. So we were anchoring the evening news. I was operating the teleprompter. And at the end, we walked down to the CNN kind of just giant platform, and they're having a hot meal and studio cameras. And Dan looked at me, and I will avoid my curse. And he looked at me and goes, I must really need the effing money, because here was the world as it had changed so dramatically. I think, you know, as the world of journalism has changed, I feel very confident in saying our moral compass, who we are, what we represent, is all about speaking truth to power. And I feel very, very grateful that I have lived a life that has taken me to war zones, done impactful documentaries. And maybe the most important documentary I did was the doc on Called 9/11, where we teamed up with 2 French filmmakers, and it came into CBS through Vanity Fair, Graydon Carter, then the publisher. And these guys were doing a doc on a rookie firefighter. Nothing had happened. But one of the brothers, Jules and Gideon Naudet, was shooting, and they went out on a routine gas leak, and they heard a low-flying plane. And he had been the producer, and his brother Gideon had been the shooter. But Jules did the perfect rule. He stayed kind of medium. And so he's watching this plane and he's watching this plane and he's watching this plane. Bang. It was the first plane into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He gets in the car with the battalion chief and he says, "Can I come with you?" And he says, "Yes." He was the only camera inside the North Tower during 9/11. And that documentary, which was extraordinary, probably is the most important piece of work I will ever do. It is the document of history. In fact, the camera and the film are in the 9/11 Museum. It is the only film and only camera in the 9/11 Museum. It's I feel blessed. I have to go to my notes because Dick did ask me to hit some points and I want to make sure that I am hitting them. So you'll have patience while I pull it up for a second. I think I've hit that. I've hit that. You know, Dick said, would Edward R. Murrow be proud or disappointed? I think Edward R. Murrow would be proud of the journalism. Look at 60 Minutes. It's the most successful magazine show known to man. It was, when was it born? It was born in the 60s. It was born September 24th, 1968. And today, in 2023, it is often one of the top 10 shows, not just news, that is being watched. The most amazing interviews. Scott Pelley going into, most recently into the Ukraine with Zelensky. Incidentally, since my name is Zorinsky and I am Russian heritage, I have claimed President Zelensky as my relative, just for the record. And actually, when I got to work on the Sean Penn documentary, he said, "Are you related to Zelensky?" I said, "Maybe not officially, but spiritually I am." I think Murrow would be proud. I think where Edward R. Murrow would feel sadness is in the financial ability to support more and different programming. And the fact that the audiences are so split and there's just too many options. And the fact that many, many, many stations and networks and streaming are points of view. So I think that's where he might have expressed some disappointment. The other point that Dick really kind of was interested in are, what are the characteristics that distinguish a good documentary from one that's merely okay? In truth, today, we're battling an enormous, enormous boogeyman, because all journalists are documentarians, but not all documentarians are journalists. A good documentary is touching something, revealing something of historical significance. When the journalists have gone away, it can be years later, but you have learned something, you have acquired something. But in reality, the problem that we're facing, and you might have read about this because it's a recent story, we won't pay for interviews. The only time there is a slight stipend is in Britain, because that has been a historical payoff. We usually say it at the end. Even journalists get compensated, but it's a small amount of money. Netflix, working with an outside production company, just paid the Gilgo Beach killer's wife, Huberman, $1 million for her documentary. And they said, well, no, they're not paying her. They're paying for home movies, videos, any kind of personal acquisitions. I have one word for that. I hope, Dick, this is off the record, right? I hope. Bullshit. When I was president of CBS News, which I will talk about in a second. Dick, you have to keep me on time check here. We did away with paying for anything. If you were doing a story you allow us to use your photos and your videos. I'm not paying for it because it's just a different way to pay for an interview, which will in fact influence the interview. So we do not pay for interviews, but it's very difficult when you're competing with somebody who does pay. I'm giving a speech. So my dog, who's about to be walked, is hiding under my legs for fear of going outside. So a good documentary will leave you thinking. A good documentary will change history. A good documentary will not be so self-righteous that we don't look at iconic, social, interesting things in society. I just did Gayle King's Jay-Z documentary for the network. When she interviewed R. Kelly, who was accused of sexually abusing young girls and keeping them hostage, I produced that documentary. So I think that the reality is we are indeed in a world where you have to hold on to your moral values. You have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror. You have to be able to feel that you have done something that contributes to the knowledge of the audience, which is really growing. You have to be transparent. I think the only regret I have, and then I'll stop talking because I see Dick's face pop up, is actually, Dan and I were en route to the Gulf War in the air, and they fired the executive producer. Not a really great management thing to do when you and the anchor are flying into a war zone, to fire your boss. However, what really happened was I was promoted, and I ended up working for a man who was not a serious journalist, and he felt that I took myself too seriously. And within about less than a year, he said, I don't want a senior broadcast producer because everybody comes to you. I'm going to do away with the position. And I begged him, and I lost my job. But CBS would not allow me out of my contract. So it was kind of an interesting conundrum. I think in the end game, he was fired, and I had his desk for many years. And every night when I was leaving the office, I would spit on it because it was the most satisfying thing for me to have survived him and indeed survive and thrive. So it's hard not seeing an audience, I must admit. You're kind of, I feel like in the Bermuda Triangle, just talking, but I hope I've shed some light, and I am open to any question. And somebody should ask me about a life-work balance, because I didn't hit that. I'm gonna take a sip of my tea.
Susan, I want to take advantage of the host's prerogative to ask the first question. And this might be a little difficult because obviously, you were very close to Dan Rather. You worked with Dan Rather on many important assignments. I was always a fan of Roger Mudd's, and I don't quite understand why it never came together for him, because he seemed like such a bright, erudite, funny
Brilliant.
kind of guy. What do you think went wrong there?
I know exactly what went wrong. Roger was brilliant. He was also an amazing writer. He would write the last line of his story and then start from the top. Dan was willing and aggressive about going everywhere. Roger was not. Dan volunteered to go to Vietnam. Dan volunteered to go into other war zones. Roger didn't really want that kind of life. He was a brilliant reporter. He wanted to stay on Capitol Hill. And so as they made the decisions of who would replace Cronkite, they felt nobody told me this, but I feel it. And I talked to Dan about it. And I've even talked to Roger about it, that Dan offered a journalist that was so driven, he would go anywhere for the story. Dan's stuff in Vietnam is incredible, incredible. And I think that I will tell you one really short story. I was the researcher at this point, and Roger in the Washington newsroom and Roger Mudd's office, they had this kind of row of open offices to the newsroom. George Herman, Roger Mudd, Marvin Kalb, Dan Shor. So I am looking at Roger. Roger picks up the phone, and Roger has a coffee cup in his other hand, and he had giant hands. So the coffee cup looked like tiny. He squeezed it. Coffee ran all over the place. He got up. He left the newsroom because that was the call that told him he was not getting the Walter Cronkite job. He walked out of the Washington Bureau and never came back.
God, that's an amazing story.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Boy,
And you know, speaking to that, like when the Saturday Night Massacre happened and we were, scrambling, we knew Dan had anchored the weekend news. And so he was coming in on the shuttle into National Airport. And so Abba Even, AKA Bill Small, the bureau chief, said, "Where the F is Rather?" And I said, "He's coming in, he's due in at 7, the 7:30 or the 8:30 plane." He said, "We got to get him here." So I said, we had a courier. I even remember these names. Oh my God, John Lesnar. And I said to John Lesnar, "Do you have an extra helmet?" "Yes." "Go to the airline shuttle, get Dan and bring him back." And that's how we brought Dan back to anchor coverage of the Saturday Night Massacre.
that's incredible. You know what? Can I ask you to call up and read the?
Oh, you want me to look in the chat? Hold on. I can look in the chat.
Yeah, you have access to the Q&A. There's 2 questions in the Q&A if you can see them.
Okay. Yes, I can.
Okay.
From Eddie, Murrow held Senator McCarthy's feet to the fire and saved our soul. True. Why is there no Murrow today who will challenge those dishonesty and unethical behavioral threats to our democracy? I think there are, but I don't know if you saw the Lesley Stahl interview with President Trump, which was a total setup. We do speak truth to power. It is a different era where there are so many reporters and correspondents that the pressure and the machine of whether it's a Democrat or a Republican is so enormous that you can report it. You can absolutely report what is truth. But the American people have such a distrust for the government, the White House, that they squash the ability to break through. When the Murrow hearings happened, America was frightened because people were being picked up and being accused of being communists. And that's not the case now. The American people feel that they have the upper hand and are holding the government responsible. The rise in power of certain alienated groups, and I'm being very careful not to call them names, call what they are, they feel they have the upper hand. So watch 60 Minutes. We are reporting on unethical behavior all the time, and corruption and scams. So I do feel it's different because the role is different. The journalists were holding Murrow was holding McCarthy accountable. Now the role has flipped. That's why you saw the January 6th insurrection. All right, I'm going to take Jane's question. Jane's question is, would you advise a young person to pursue a career in journalism today? Absolutely. As social networking and inaccurate reporting is so prevalent. We need more solid journalists. What is a journalist? Is it somebody who goes on social networking? I'm actually working on a documentary that is about the investigative explosion on the social media, on TikTok, on Facebook, on on Instagram, of people thinking that they're going to help solve a crime. They're not trained. They're not under anybody's authority. They can spew any name, falsely accused. So I think we do need more journalists that are responsible journalists, not just somebody who thinks they're a journalist. So I answer yes to that question. Okay, Marcia is next. How is political pressure applied today, and to whom, and how can you counter it? Well, I definitely will address that question. During the Trump White House, if you asked a question that he didn't like, he would, in front of everybody, say that your whole organization never reports the truth. You're a bad reporter. And it became this kind of cat and mouse game. And I was the president of the news division at that point, and I called the White House correspondents together and I said, you cannot engage. You cannot talk back to the president. I don't care what he says. You're there to represent the American people. And you need to have a second question, third question, if he keeps going on the attack. In the Biden administration, it's a different form. They will obfuscate some issues. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was excuse my language, an effing tragedy. I happened to talk to former CIA Director George Tenet, because we had done a CIA documentary for Showtime. And I asked him what he thought, and he said, I cried. All the effort, all the lives lost for nothing. And the Biden administration said everybody was expecting it. People should have been aware. You know what? When you see a situation deteriorating, you have to make adjustments. So I think, in terms of Trump, we tried to just tune out the noise and just stay focused on the story. I said to the White House correspondents, if he tweets something and your name is on it, do not tweet back. Do not engage. And hopefully it will stop. And you just have to keep pressing forward. You just have to keep going with what your message is and do it in different ways. 60 Minutes, Evening News, Eye on America, there was sexual abuse in the military that had been shoved under the rug, and Nora O'Donnell did a multi-part series. And the Secretary of Defense the next day came out with new rules and regulations. So you just got to keep pushing. And only somebody's coming in. Does he have a question? Okay, I'm going to go on to, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Genevieve Norton. Thank you for thanking me. And thank you for thanking me for the journalistic integrity. It's a long road. And I always say this when I give speeches. If something doesn't feel right or smell right, or somebody in a local newsroom or anybody asks you to do something that doesn't feel quite right, don't do it. If you lose your job, you lose your job. But what you don't lose is your integrity. I'll call you AA, and I don't mean Alcoholics Anonymous, anonymous attendee. Are the American people you mentioned the very wealthy who have more power than the general public? I'm not sure I understand that question. Are you talking about the people who hold influence? Can you just write me real quick and say yes or no? Let's see, I'm watching.
Okay, can you make the box disappear for a minute?
Okay, so I'm not quite sure I understand the question. You know, I think if you look at his question is really the American people, the wealthy people have more power than the general public. Yes, to some extent. However, if you look at the election of Donald Trump, and you look at the insurrection on January 6th, when he had lost the election, the American people spoke. The election had the American people speaking. They absolutely loved Donald Trump taking no prisoners, not accepting the world as people knew it, even though he himself is a wealthy man, although the district attorney in New York doesn't think as valuable as his properties were assessed. But, you know, do wealthy people have power? Yes. But do the American people have power? Yes. Yes. I once wanted to do a series when I was running politics where we kind of went around the country to different cities and pockets to understand the dissatisfaction with the country. And when I wrote the second line, I said, you know, it's our job, because a lot of people don't understand the unhappiness. It's our job for us to introduce America to itself.
Susan, we're going to be over time shortly, but again, I'd like to use the host prerogative and say, I don't think anyone ever asked a single male reporter, producer, or CBS employee if they were putting in their fair share of time at home. And it seems unfair to ask that of a woman, but because people always do, let me ask you, how did you address the situation at home, and did you feel guilt about it?
My mid-year assessment by the head of CBS, George Cheeks, gave me an amazing review of my team and our content. And he said, the one thing you have to work on is work-life balance. And we adopted my daughter Zoe 26 years ago. I had done a documentary on the abandoned girls in China, and we decided we were going to adopt. And I definitely worked hard. I definitely traveled, but not to a war zone. I never went to a war zone. And I thought that I did balance my life at home and with my daughter. My daughter has had a lot of issues and still does. And I constantly ask myself, was it because I was working too much, not with her? I'm not a very social person. I don't go to parties. I don't, I'm not that kind of a social butterfly. So I felt like I was really spending a lot of time. Did I work a lot? Yes. And I will, to the day I die, worry that had I had a better work-life balance, maybe her psychological dynamic would be different. And she talks about it now. I mean, it's like it still haunts her, but it is my pain of every single day. I worked with a colleague once who I do tend to be not stressed, but no, uncomfortable. And he said, I know what you suffer from. And I said, what? He said, you suffer from unspecified dread. And I thought, really true. It is really important to have a work-life balance. I'm very conscious of emailing, even today, at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. The greatest discovery for me was on computers, delay delivery. So that I'm not expecting you to answer me at 2 a.m. and I'll have delivery at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. I don't know how to operate. I think because as I grew up, I never felt smart enough. I never felt that I was up to the challenge. And so I worked harder. I got up earlier. If we were traveling with Reagan, I was in the office earlier. I staked out Jimmy Carter at 5 a.m. So that feeling of insecurity of my own intellect created a dynamic which to this day, I can't shake, which is I work 7 days a week now, because we're a small group. Literally last night, I got 6 different episodes of 6 shows in production that I have to screen. And because our contract says we have to screen and give notes back in 3 days. So what am I supposed to do? So, but my daughter to this day says you cared more about work than me. Not true, but that's her perception. And we all know perception is much more important than reality.
Susan, I think that is a great note to end on. I want to thank you so much for one of the most interesting, valuable, and insightful interviews and presentations we've ever had here. I will always be grateful to you. Thank you.
Well, even if it's not true, I'll take it for today.
All right, everyone. I hope you have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.